Welcome to this third installment of the Corporate Responsibility to Respect, CR2R for short, webinar series. Today, we're going to explore integrating, tracking, and monitoring human rights risk management. This webinar will focus on the importance of effective human rights risk management through appropriate integration into ongoing risk management roles, functions, policies, and processes. We will explore means for tracking and monitoring companies' efforts to address salient and material human rights risks to support investors in soliciting the needed information from companies regarding the success of those risk management efforts. We'll showcase some good practice examples, and you'll see here in a second, we're going to hear from the firsthand experience of 3 leaders in the field. But before we get started, just a few logistical matters. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Investor Alliance website and YouTube channel. I should have introduced myself. I'm Rebecca D. Winter-Schmidt. I am the Associate Director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. But you can check out our events page and YouTube channel for a recording of this. You are off camera and on mute to improve the sound quality of the webinar. Should you, though, have any questions during when the speakers are speaking or afterwards during a 15-minute Q&A session at the end, please feel free to pop those questions into the Q&A function. The chat has been disabled, however. In terms of our speakers, I want to thank our speakers who are joining us today. Time constraints do not allow me to share their impressive bios, but let me briefly introduce them and share what they will be covering. So first off, we're going to be hearing from Ian Beers, who is Performance Director at MSS Global, and he will address the integration of human rights into enterprise risk management systems. He will answer questions such as how findings from human rights impact assessments can be integrated into a risk management system while ensuring that risks to rights holders are prioritized and addressed. He will speak to how companies can track and monitor the effectiveness of responses to identified risks and how that feeds into a continual improvement process. Next, we're going to hear from Talia Suissa, Engagement Manager of the Social Transformation Team at the World Benchmarking Alliance. And she will provide us with an example of what assessment of corporate human rights performance looks like as conducted by the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, a benchmark within the WBA. She will elaborate on what organizations like the WBA look for when assessing companies on their implementation of human rights due diligence processes and their ongoing human rights risk management efforts. And then we'll hear from Sarah Morris-Lang, Manager of the Social Equality Initiatives at BMO Global Asset Management. And she will talk about the role of the investor in ensuring portfolio companies are managing their human rights risks accordingly. She's going to share how BMO did research on Canadian companies' human rights performance, including their due diligence efforts to ensure that they're managing their risks, and how they've used that data to engage companies. Asaba, if you can move to the actually 2 slides forward. But just briefly to recap what the CR2R webinar series is about. With this webinar series, what we're hoping to do is systematically explore the elements of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights as framed in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights to educate and support investors as they assess and engage with their portfolio companies on their human rights performance. We hope this is valuable to a number of audiences. We hope active investors and investors who are seeking to engage with companies on their human rights performance will find these valuable. And certainly also it should be valuable to portfolio companies who themselves need to disclose to investors their human rights commitments and performance, as well as civil society organizations and other stakeholders seeking to hold companies to account for their human rights performance. As I said, it's a 5-part series, and today we're going to focus on that second step in that due diligence process, the integrating, tracking, and monitoring human rights risk management. Asaba, if you could proceed to the next slide. So just briefly, what is a CR2R? Very, very quickly, laid out in UN Guiding Principle 15, it has 3 elements. The first is that companies should have in place a policy commitment to respect human rights. That was topic of webinar 1. I should note all of the previous webinars are on the website and YouTube channel that I just mentioned. Second, companies must have in place a human rights due diligence process to identify, seize, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their impacts on human rights. This includes processes for assessing actual and potential human rights impacts, often referred to as human rights impact assessment. That was the topic of our second webinar. Today, as we're going to explore, they should have in place a process for integrating and acting upon assessment findings and tracking their responses to those identified risks. And then thirdly, processes to communicate those findings. And thirdly, companies need to have a process to remediate adverse human rights impacts they've caused or to which they contribute. And very importantly, throughout all three elements of the CR2R, in particular throughout the due diligence process, very important that stakeholders are being engaged. And those last two matters will be subject of our fourth and fifth webinar. Asaba, if you could proceed to the next slide. Oh yes, and lest I forget, we actually, in lead up to this webinar, we have put out 2 video logs, kindly were contributed to by Suna Skadegaard Thorsen of Global CSR. Those 2 webinars discuss in depth the manner in which companies can be linked to human rights harms through either a causal relationship, a contribution relationship, or a direct linkage through their business relationships. This is often referred to as the involvement framework. Relatedly, he also explores in a second video log, very in-depth, the concept of the exercise of corporate leverage to address harms, depending on how a company is linked to harm. So if you haven't had a chance, I encourage you to look at those video logs so you can go more in depth than what we've been able to cover today on those 2 particular topics. There's also a series of other video logs addressing a range of relevant issues around the investor case for human rights, the relationship between human rights, the Sustainable Development Goals, and ESG investing, governance indicators with regards to rights respecting corporate culture, another video log on child rights and human rights impact assessment, and much more. They're very kind of short, dense, but concise information about concepts that are relevant in the UN guiding principles. In terms of our focus today, as I said, let me just briefly tell you, we're going to be going deep on UN guiding principle 19 and 20. 19 refers to the idea of integrating and acting upon findings from the human rights impact assessment process, and that entails 2 things. First, the assignation and resourcing of the responsibility to address impacts and ensuring that there is oversight of those efforts. And then second, taking action to address identified impacts, again, depending on the type of connection to that harm, causation, contribution, or direct leverage, as well as the need to use leverage by a company to address those harms. Of course, there may be situations where companies cannot effectively prevent or mitigate an impact, and companies may need to consider then what responsible disengagement or exit might look like. And then UNGP 20 speaks particularly to tracking the effectiveness of responses to impacts, making sure that they're having the desired outcome in terms of preventing, ceasing, or mitigating risks, and also ensuring that there are appropriate KPIs put in place, be they quantitative or qualitative, to track those efforts. And throughout that process, also drawing on feedback from internal and external stakeholders, in particular from affected rights holders. And in the end, that's what this due diligence process is all about. Briefly outlined there or depicted there in the OECD, the diagram of that circle of due diligence, that continual improvement process. And I think you'll see Sarah picking up on that again in her presentation. So with that, I will hand it now over to Ian to speak to us about what effective enterprise risk management looks like when human rights are integrated into that. Thanks for being here today, Ian. Over to you.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Rebecca. So I'll just share my screen now. And good day, everyone. My name is Ian Beers. As Rebecca said, I'm the Performance Director of MSS Global, a certification body specializing in international business assurance standards. And I'm also the British Institute G14 committee chairperson, charged with developing a British standard on human rights due diligence. Probably the latter one is what brought me here, but the first one actually gave me food for thought and producing or thinking about my presentation here. So although I don't have personal experience with investment companies, I believe I can relate to your work as MSS Global manages a portfolio of around 120 security and other companies, many of which operate in conflict-affected areas that effectively require heightened due diligence on our part to protect, in our case, our all-important accreditations. So today I'm honored to share insights on integrating human rights impact assessment findings into effective risk management systems, tracking responses, ongoing monitoring, and the continued improvement process. These topics are crucial for fostering responsible business practices and respecting human rights. Thanks for having me. So as a caveat, I will be taking a management systems approach to this topic. So some of the methods I touch upon may not be suitable for application in the investment industry, but then again, they may well do. So from my experience in MSS Global, I see risk from many diverse perspectives and often encounter misconceptions. Some believe risk management is merely about protecting the company at the expense of others, which is an ill-informed and disingenuous view. However, a well-structured risk management system, such as one based on ISO 31000, the global standard for risk management, does not hold these biases. Risk as defined by ISO 31000 is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. I prefer to understand risk simply as uncertainty, and risk management as a systematic approach to decision-making to reduce uncertainty. This recognizes uncertainty. Recognizes that uncertainty can be both positive and negative, depending on the context. The uncertainty you may have for a new investment opportunity is an example of upside risk, and one which you want to enhance potentially. ISO 50000 and similar frameworks can be applied to any organization, regardless of their size, scale, or context. Risk management is essentially a human decision-making process, not done for bureaucracy's sake, but to increase certainty and achieve objectives. A holistic risk management system addresses all types of risks at a variety of levels, from strategic to operational. And for MSS Global, we have a method that we produce, very similar to ISO 31000, which is has risk management at its core. So when integrating human rights findings, we must prioritize the risks to rights holders, not just the business. The perspective taken should be on the impact of people and their rights. This does not mean that business interests and human rights are mutually exclusive. Indeed, enlightened self-interest aligns business success with respecting of business rights. So to illustrate this, we often draw together risk criteria of different forms. My example here is intentionally blurred, as it's important that organizations customize their risk criteria, in this case, a qualitative risk criteria table, to fit their own situation. Effective risk criteria provide actionable insights for decision-making. A common approach is to use likelihood and severity, or you might call it probability and impact. In human rights risk management, severity is a combination, slightly different. It's of scale, scope, and remediability. So for many, a change in mindset may be crucial to integrate human rights into risk management, although this is not new, as traditional operating risk management activities like health and safety already align with human rights principles, focusing on the well-being of individuals rather than just the company's bottom line. One potential suggestion for investors is, when doing due diligence, if that's the phrase you'd use, is to review the risk management frameworks of your investee companies, paying close attention to their risk criteria, their thresholds, and where these are lacking, investors potentially can provide tools and guidance to help companies improve, ensuring a better understanding and management of risks in general and human rights specifically. So moving on to the meat, how to track responses effectively. Sorry, slides seem to be automating themselves here. The United Nations Guiding Principle 20 states that business enterprises should track the effectiveness of responses. This concept is well established in risk management, project management, and even everyday simple day-to-day tasks. So it's something you've been doing already. Although basic, once an action is deemed necessary, it should be smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. I'm sure you've all heard that. Monitoring the response ensures it is progressive and effective. I have a very simple example. If a gardener waters the plants in a garden, but uses salt water instead of fresh water, the task of watering is technically done, but the effectiveness is not as expected. They'll kill the plants. For investors, ensuring your investee companies follow through on critical actions, on necessary actions, is critical. Business enterprises often have established practices in place for tracking responses. However, the effectiveness of these practices depends on your ability to influence or leverage those companies. So hopefully I'm pushing across that. Just general practice that you're already used to is very useful in this sense. At MSS Global, we may face a similar situation to you as investors. We provide certifications to our portfolio clients, putting our reputation and the value of that assurance we provide on the line. MSS Global's reputation and our value are directly linked to the performance of the companies we certify. Therefore, it's crucial that we manage the risks associated with our clients' performance. To maintain our value and manage these risks, we conduct due diligence. For MSS Global, this takes the form of audits. And when an issue is identified, we require a corrective action from the organization, similar to a corrective action request a customer may require of a supplier in a supply chain relationship. The progress of these actions is best managed using the same successful methods applied in other business activities, namely project management principles. Leverage plays a significant role in the success of these actions. Small organizations or investment companies lacking individual leverage might need to apply collective leverage, a topic for another discussion. And I think one of the video logs was very informative on that that I watched prior to this. With sufficient leverage, we request organizations to provide a root cause analysis and a corrective action plan. The root cause analysis is essential because it distinguishes between an immediate correction of the issue at hand, the fix, and the longer term corrective action. Immediate corrective action, as I said, detects the problem and addresses the problem without delay. Sometimes that is what is needed, an immediate fix. So for example, if you're in a dinghy in a body of water and there's suddenly a hole in the dinghy, you need to put a patch on it immediately to stop the loss of air. However, if the root cause is a submerged object remains, the problem will reoccur. Therefore, the full corrective action involves two components: the immediate fix and identifying and tackling the underlying systemic root cause to prevent reoccurrence. In this method, an organization raises the identified problems to the organization in question and requires both a root cause analysis and corrective action plan. If the RCA is superficial or insincere, we push it back and require further investigation. Without providing the solution, you can support an organization to facilitate their thought process, ensuring they identify the solid root cause. Once the root cause is identified, you can then review and shape the corrective action, once again, through principally rejecting it and leading questions until we're satisfied that it will address the issue fully, including its root cause. Any credible action plan must include accountabilities and deadlines, turning aspirations into smart objectives that contribute to the organization's achievements of the human rights objectives. Okay, again, the ability to monitor and the tools you have at your disposal are closely linked to your ability to influence the organization or have leverage over the investee company. I imagine smaller investors may have to take a passive desktop research approach using open source information to understand how an investee is operating. Alternatively, small investors maybe could work together collectively with others to gain strength in numbers and elicit a better response from a powerful investee company. Larger investors might, I imagine, simply have to request an action and the investee company will obediently comply promptly. Good practice in monitoring can take various forms, and the first one I will cover is the ability to conduct non-financial second-party audit and assess for yourselves an organization's premises, records, and digital spaces. This is often secured in agreements through a right to audit clause. I don't know if this is something you have in your agreements, but the term audit often carries a lot of baggage, similarly to misconceptions about risk management. Management systems auditing is not about bureaucratic displays of paperwork. It's about conducting effectiveness or concluding effectiveness through objective evidence. As such, the focus needs to be on expected outcomes, what results should be achieved regardless of what glossy paperwork states on its cover. We may start by auditing policies and procedures, but it must be remembered that these are essentially promises written on paper. There is no evidence in these documents that the organization has conducted itself as stated. When I train my auditors, I emphasize that while it is valuable to hear from a company executive about their commitments, always, as Ronald Reagan popularized during discussions with the Soviet Union on nuclear disarmament, trust but verify. If you do not have the leverage to conduct a thorough audit, you may rely on other approaches such as surveys, interviews, stakeholder engagement. Different contexts may require different methods to provide a true transparent status. It might not only be leverage that determines your approach. With numerous investments, you must apply your judgment and take a risk-based approach, applying resource-heavy, costly audit methods to those that present the most risk, and use less resource-intensive methods such as surveys and interviews for lower-risk investments. These assumptions, though, can be wrong, and you need to be ready to adjust and change your approach accordingly. I won't go into detail about managing an audit program, But suffice it to say, I imagine that, like with us, you need to have a formulated monitoring approach to your investee companies. A well-considered, maintained system should not be left to chance. Looking at perspectives for continual improvement, there's a couple of perspectives for continual improvement. The first is your own continual improvement process. You have a human rights due diligence system that you apply both within your organization and in your due diligence activities on your investee companies. The second perspective is the improvement process for raising performance by your investees companies. This ties back to the tracking of responses, where a weakness in a system that could lead to an adverse human rights impact is identified, and where an actual adverse impact has occurred and needs to be remedied. Responding to such issues will result in improvement. Improvement for both perspectives should be continual, reflecting the natural way humans improve through iteration. The lessons are often very slight, but can be quite big jumps at times. The purpose of continual improvement is to ensure that human rights practices remain effective, relevant, address any gaps or deficiencies in practice, adapt to emerging challenges and changing environments, and foster a culture of continual learning and improvement within the organization or the investee company. There are many tools available that can provide high-level advice, but often these tools are essentially PDF documents that are easy to read but hard to implement. As an organization that manages a portfolio of companies in which we have invested our reputation and accreditations, we manage their continual improvement through surveying them. Conducting management system audits is our primary method there. And when required, raising opportunities for improvement. Without providing them with the solution, we educate them, facilitate their thinking, and encourage them, often with leverage. But in our case, it is the threat to suspend or withdraw certification. I suppose that would be similar to your position of disinvesting. One thing, for example, is a human rights due diligence assistance we can provide MS Global. We provide our method grid tool to some organizations that contains actionable advice, generic, and requires them to tailor it for their own circumstances and then put in actionable projects to move forward. These then can be displayed in various formats. The important thing here is this is just normal business practice you should be realizing here, nothing unusual. It all integrates as that. So including project Gantt charts, lists of tasks with assigned people and progress and other dashboards. If permitted, we can monitor their actions through access to this tool. That's not often the case though. There are many such tools available. You probably already have something similar already established. If not, I'd encourage you to shop around and promote an approach that supports your investee companies. It can be as simple as a spreadsheet or as complex as needed. Continued improvement involves identifying weaknesses, deficiencies, changes in the environment, or errors that should not have occurred, seeing them as opportunities for improvement and putting together actions to address these issues, strengthening weaknesses, closing gaps, learning from experience, and improving in general. So with that, I thank you all very much. And that's the conclusion of that show there.
Thank you so much, Ian. And really, we're benefiting from your wealth of experience, actually, going in and auditing companies' management systems to see if they're effectively addressing human rights risks. Before I hand it over, I just wanted to ask you one question, because you had talked at the outset about kind of a need for a change in mindset from risk managers. I'm just curious, based on your experience, if you could just briefly speak to maybe, an example of what your traditional risk managers might find most challenging in terms of incorporating human rights into existing enterprise risk management systems, and maybe one thing that comes quite natural where they pick up the UNGPs and say, aha, I see this is exactly what we basically already do. So can you maybe give us an example of what's challenging and what's just like a natural click there?
And I would say this depends on the level of risk management. So at the strategic or at program risk management, often what is being looked at is the risk to the project's successful completion, such as risk to the timeline of something, or risk to the financial delivering in budget. And these risks are very much about making sure that the future success is in place. And so it really does take the perspective of not particularly the company protecting itself, but making sure it puts everything in place to achieve success. I'd say in human rights, it's more akin to operational, tactical level risk management, where you're really trying to get any risk and drive it down to as low as reasonably practicable. So if you take health and safety, intrinsically a human rights issue. Again, at that point, even most companies are always looking at health and safety or environmental management through, in an operational sense, through the lens of making sure that they don't cause pollution events, they don't harm workers or other bystanders. And that takes a rights holder perspective when you look at the operational level risk management piece. As I said, when you get into the portfolio risk management or project risk management and trying to make sure that a project doesn't get derailed by an issue, then there's tolerances taken, and that can be where the impact on individuals, on rights holders, isn't necessarily clear.
Yeah,
So I'd say in some
speaks,
cases it's done very well, some cases not so well. Just
yeah. Well, certainly speaks to the need to integrate those human rights policy across levels in the company, right? I mean, from those who are making the bigger strategic decisions down to those who are involved in day-to-day operations. Thanks so much. And now I'm going to turn it over to Talia. And Talia is, because one thing Ian actually had said was about the need for information for investors. Investors need to have access to something that summarizes the kind of human rights performance that companies are achieving. And I think that's exactly what the corporate human rights benchmark is about. So Talia, over to you.
Great, thank you. And Asaba, if we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So I'll start by just quickly introducing the World Benchmarking Alliance. We are a non-for-profit organization that develops open source benchmarks and methodologies that measure companies' performance on the Sustainable Development Goals. To do that, we developed 7 systems transformations that you can see on the screen. We assessed 2,000 of the world's most influential companies in a series of benchmarks across these transformations, ranking and measuring them on their contributions to climate, decarbonization, digital inclusion, nature, and human rights. Following the SDGs Leave No One Behind principle, the social transformation in WBA sits at the heart of our model. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I will focus today, as Rebecca mentioned, on our corporate human rights benchmark, more specifically looking at our human rights due diligence indicators in the benchmark. So a bit on the CHRB. The CHRB's methodology is grounded in the UNGPs. Our methodologies, benchmarks, and individual company scorecards are free and publicly available. We benchmark and rank 230 of the largest companies across 5 sectors, and have published 5 benchmark iterations to date. The next slide, please. Thank you. We have 5 human rights due diligence indicators. So it's very similar to the OECD kind of diagram. We did separate identifying from assessing purely for research reasons. But we have 5 indicators. So identifying, assessing, integrating, and taking action, tracking, and communicating. Today, obviously, I will focus on the integrating and taking action and the tracking indicators in our benchmark. If we can move to the next one. Great. So when we look at integrating and taking action, so I put the indicator on the right-hand side of the screen, but I did try to summarize it. Again, all of the methodologies are publicly available, so I will provide the links afterwards. But what do we look for? We basically want to see that the company integrates the findings of its assessments of human rights risks and impacts into relevant internal functions and processes to take appropriate actions. The way we assess that is that we look for a description of the global system a company has in place, or alternatively, the company can provide one example of how it integrated findings from its assessment and took action on the specific risks or negative impact. The way we score the company, I won't get into the whole detail, but we divided each of the indicators to score 1 and score 2. Score 1 is the more basic fundamental requirements, and score 2 is what we perceive as leading practice. And in order to meet the full score, the company has to both describe the global system that it has in place and provide an example that would kind of demonstrate how it took action on a specific risk, as well as make sure that it engaged with affected stakeholders in the process. If we can move to the next slide, please. So the indicator follows a similar structure. We want to see that the company tracks and evaluates the effectiveness of actions taken in response to negative human rights risks and impacts. And we also want to see that the company describes how it uses the information to improve processes and systems on an ongoing basis. What we look for is either, again, a description of the system companies have in place to track their approach, or an example of a lesson learned while tracking the effectiveness of an action taken. Again, to get the full score, they have to show both. And of course, we also want to see that the company includes engaging with stakeholders and vulnerable groups when evaluating the effectiveness of the actions taken. Now we can move to the next slide. I have 4 leading practice examples, Rebecca. If I run out of time, just say out of time and I'll stop there.
No worries, Taya. I think we're interested in hearing some concrete examples,
Okay.
so please go ahead.
Yeah, but please feel free to stop me if I go over time. So note that I only took parts of the information we have in our company scorecards in order to have it fit into the slide. And I provided the link to the full scorecard, so maybe it wouldn't necessarily seem comprehensive enough. But here we're seeing Freeport's assessment against our integrating and taking action indicator. So what do we look for? We see that they have a high-level description of the system they have in place for taking action. In the box on the right-hand side, you can see that they say operations work with cross-functional teams to develop human rights impact action plans. We also see that the system is not specific to one geography or site, but it is global in nature. We see that it applies both to business partners and not only to own operations, which is one of the requirements that we look for in that specific indicator. We also see that the company, they also provide a specific example of an action taken. So the one shared here is on a training they provided on preventing child labor in Indonesia. And they also describe how they involve stakeholders in their human rights impact assessment and how they support the continuous improvement of their human rights management system. There is more details. I'm just trying to summarize here. We can move maybe to the next slide. I'll provide another example. So here we have Unilever, again, on integrating the assessment and taking action. So we see that the company is describing the system it has in place to take action on human rights. So there's a dedicated section in the report for each of the salient issues they identified. For each of the salient human rights issues, the company disclosed actions taken, initiatives, projects implemented, progress where relevant, and some actual examples, including own operations and supply chain, again. As mentioned, the system they have in place covers the own operation and supply chain element, which is actually part of our score to the company. And they give an example of an action taken. So I took one because there were several, but here they mention how they ran an internal training responding to a risk identified in the UAE on the related to the employer pays principle. And they ran an external training as well for suppliers on ethical recruitment with a focus on recruitment fees. So you get a concrete example of an action they took related to a risk they identified as part of their human rights due diligence process. And again, I won't go into all the details, but for the sake of time, but they also provide an example of how they engage with stakeholders when taking actions on risks impacts identified. I'll now move to the next slide to share a good practice example on tracking effectiveness of action. So I stayed with Unilever just to kind of follow with the same company to kind of show the process, but then we'll go and look at a different company. So they have a pretty good score here, but not a perfect score, which I think is also interesting to look at. So for the first element, they did not meet the requirement for having a system for evaluating the effectiveness of actions. The reason being is that they describe how they evaluated their overall human rights due diligence process, but not necessarily how they evaluated as part of tracking the actions they took on the salient risks. So an important distinction, very interesting to look at if you want to in the scorecard. They do provide an example on the lesson learned. So remember, they provided a training on recruitment fees. Now they provide information on what came out of the training and what else they need to do to address the issue. One of the things they identified was that a sustainable fee repayment plan needs to be established with suppliers and workers, as well as other conclusions. So I wanted to kind of provide that example as they took an action, they tracked the action, and they kind of readapted their response to a specific risk. And then they also provide an example of how they involve stakeholders when tracking the effectiveness of actions. Specifically here, we see an example of women working in tea plantations in Kenya, and how they incorporated their input on safety measures, and readapted their action plan on that specific risk. I'll go on to the last example I have here. Thank you. So here we're moving to the apparel sector within the text. So again, we can see that they have a system to track actions and their effectiveness. Here they mentioned their worker at the HART program, so kind of an overall system in place to track the effectiveness of actions. They provide an example of lessons learned from tracking actions taken. Here they focus on migrant workers in Turkey and how they reevaluated their priorities after feedback received during the training they provided. So again, we're seeing this continuous improvement. So they identify a negative impact or a risk, they go ahead with an action. If it's training, something comes out of the training that makes them kind of readapt their response to that. So that is also part of tracking. And then for each of the priority areas, so they do involve stakeholders, and they mentioned that for each of the priority areas they identified, they are engaging with the relevant stakeholders, including obviously affected stakeholders. I think I have 2 more slides. Rebecca, let me know if I'm running out of time.
Yeah, maybe Talia, we could save those if needed for the Q&A, because I'm just a little bit aware of the time. Because I also just want to ask you one quick question before we hand over to Sarah. One of the things that, and these are terrific examples, and obviously you've chosen companies who have generally scored well, Unilever, Inditex, and Freeport McMoran, just with regards to stakeholder engagement, because we certainly do see, I think, if companies are going to undertake an HRA, they generally try to do some form of stakeholder engagement, probably less so examples of consistently involving stakeholders beyond that in terms of actually, monitoring and tracking how they're, taking corrective actions. What was the overall trend that you saw? And I know you put out your annual key finding, or annual was along with your benchmarks when they released, you put out your key findings report. What has been overall the key findings with regards to how well companies are doing that stakeholder engagement across the due diligence process?
Thanks for the question. So I know we said I'll finish with the slides, but I have a graph on the last slide. If we can move 2 slides, please.
Sure.
Specifically on that. So there we go. We are seeing that, as you mentioned, Rebecca, when it comes to identifying stakeholders, are not mostly, again, this is a quarter of companies that we identified that engage stakeholders, but the highest scores that we're seeing for stakeholder engagement are the initial process of the due diligence process, massively dropping when it comes to tracking, and surprisingly improving when it comes to communicating results. But acting and tracking are really the 2 indicators where we rarely see examples. It was very difficult for me to find 4 company examples for webinar. I think we have about, I don't know, I'm trying to think, 4 companies maybe that got a perfect score every year on these 2 indicators.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
great.
definitely seeing a drop when it comes to taking action and tracking.
Great. Well, good to know that that's where some of the problems lie. Good to know there are some good practice examples that investors can point to when engaging with their companies. Thanks so much, Talia. Okay, last but certainly not least, I'm going to hand things over to Sarah, and she's going to talk to us a bit about some of the research that BMO has done and utilized in its engagement with its portfolio companies. Thanks so much, Sarah, for being here.
Thank you, and it's my pleasure. So wonderful to hear all the information that Ian and Talia are sharing, and there's some. It's really relevant to some of the things I'll be talking about. To start, we can go to the next slide, please. This is the graphic that Rebecca indicated I'd be referring back to. I'm going to be returning to this throughout my presentation to connect the information I share about our work and process here at BMO-GAM with the various steps as outlined in the due diligence process. I like this graphic because it illustrates that human rights and environmental due diligence is an iterative process requiring continuous improvement. And I'd also like to point out or emphasize that as investors, we are in a parallel process of implementation alongside issuers. So most investors are at early stages of formalization and systematization of UNGPs aligned HRDD, and access to good quality human rights data is still challenging, although the human rights benchmarks are instrumental, and I'll get into that a little bit more just further on in my presentation. But of course, disclosures will improve over time as issuers are now required to disclose against new mandatory due diligence laws like the CSRD and Canada's newly enacted Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Prevention Act. But there's still a lot we can do in the interim, and the important point is that we're getting started. So today I'll share a little bit about what we've been doing to fulfill our obligations under steps 2 and 3, and what our plans are to fulfill obligations under steps 4 and 5. But first, a very quick overview of the characteristics of our holdings to set the stage. At BMO-GAM, the majority of our investments are passive holdings in index-based ETFs, electronically traded funds, but we also have rules-based and quantitative-driven mutual funds, as well as actively managed funds based on fundamentals. And also, while we are invested globally, the majority of our holdings are based in North America and disproportionately relative to the market size in Canada. So our majority passive holdings and rules-based mutual funds present some limitations with regards to ESG and HRDD integration into investment decision-making, given the defined investable universe within these approaches is limited and kind of rigidly defined. So our best approach at this time is to advance HRDD to administer, and we do that through a strong stewardship program that includes engagement, market education, policy advocacy, and standards development and proxy voting in support of policies and practices to encourage company adoption and implementation of good human rights performance. Finally, BMO-GAM's RI team is based in Toronto, so the majority of our team's work is focused on this market. And then for our holdings in Europe, Middle East, and Asia, we contract a third-party service provider to conduct stewardship on our behalf with our holdings in those regions. Okay, with that, I'll move on now to how we've been approaching HRDD over the last couple of years. So in 2022, we decided to conduct our own research to get an understanding of where the biggest actual or potential human rights risks were for our Canadian issuers, given that global human rights benchmarks, like the corporate human rights benchmark and the chain benchmark, do not often cover Canadian publicly traded companies just due to the smaller size of Canadian companies relative to their global peers. And so we undertook this research. We applied those frameworks to the public disclosures of these 29 companies across 6 sectors. So we did this to try to better identify and assess adverse impacts and risk areas. So we started with conducting desk research and looked at the 6 sectors to understand, first of all, what are the most salient actual or potential human rights risks across these sectors. And then, as I said, we selected 29 of the largest Canadian issuers across these sectors and assessed them using the benchmarks. And of course, as mentioned already, we know that disclosures are only a proxy indicator of performance, but nevertheless an essential element of UNGPs and an important starting point for accountability. So this research enabled us to get a snapshot of where Canadian companies were in their adoption and implementation of human rights due diligence, and hence where there might be elevated risk across our investments. And we published the research in an anonymized fashion in February 2023 to try to broadly raise market awareness in Canada, best practices, and in anticipation of forthcoming and now enacted mandatory due diligence laws. If we could go to the next slide, please. So in our research, we looked at companies in the apparel, consumer goods, and discretionary spending, consumer staples, mining, oil and gas, and telecommunications sectors. The highest average score was 61% in the mining sector, and the lowest was 6% in consumer discretionaries. The high score in mining is an indicator of this sector being one of the highest risk sectors for adverse human rights impacts and served as a pointer for where we needed to dig deeper. The average score across all companies assessed was 30%. The highest company score was 92% from one company in the mining sector, which interestingly is also a company with one of the highest number of public human rights controversies, which I'll touch on further in a few minutes. The lowest company score was 0 from a consumer staples food and food distribution company. The overall trend we found across sectors was that companies appear to make better public policy commitments to respect human rights, but still have considerable room to improve on implementation of UNGPs aligned human rights practices, including tracking and reporting and remediation when adverse impacts occur. Next slide, please. So conducting this research was part of step 2 in our due diligence process, as it helped to inform our efforts under step 3 to work to cease, prevent, and mitigate adverse impacts. The research was used to inform a multi-year engagement campaign on UNGPs aligned human rights due diligence adoption and implementation with select holdings, and it remains ongoing. So the research process in which we applied the CHRB and the know the chain benchmarks to company disclosures provided us with instrumental key performance indicators to try to understand and assess each company's performance on human rights. And it helps us articulate our expectations for best practices during engagements. The latest report from CHRB on the key findings would be an excellent document for investors to refer to for going forward engagements. Since the beginning of the campaign, we've had over 80 engagements with 24 companies, and we continue to monitor, engage, and track progress and milestones. Many of our initial discussions focused on our own investor expectations on UNGPs aligned human rights due diligence, and we provided education related to the UNGPs. It's here in Canada. Understanding is it's all just kind of new to many companies, and of course there's a spectrum and range of understanding. But we also provided some education on new and mandatory human rights corporate accountability laws and priority areas of focus depending on where the company was at. For example, some of the key themes we focus on in our engagements with companies are very clear public policy commitments, adequate resourcing, board and senior level oversight, and the critical importance of effectively integrating rights perspectives into business model strategy and operations and tracking on an ongoing basis. If we could have the next slide, please. So to provide a little bit more color.
Sorry, Sarah, don't mean to interrupt you. Just, I don't know if it's maybe your microphone or something, but there's a little bit of, maybe, I don't know if others are hearing it while you're breaking up just a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Should I could turn off my video, which might help reduce, like, enhance.
That's sounding better already right there. Let's maybe go with that first. But yeah, that sounds already better. Thank you. Sorry about that. Didn't want to interrupt.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. So I'll just speak a little bit about our findings from the consumer staple sector and our related engagements. So in Canada, our research, which was undertaken in 2022, indicated that at that time, based on disclosures, companies in this sector were in the early stages of implementing best practices to ensure respect for human rights. And one company actually scored 0 just due to very limited disclosure, which obviously is a key component of accountability in the UNGPs framework. The other 4 companies we assessed performed moderately well on policy commitments, but all seem to require enhanced board and executive level oversight. Implementation of human rights due diligence practices as indicated by 7 different KPIs from the Know the Chain benchmark, was limited across all 5 companies. Disclosure of human rights impact assessments and engagement with rights holders and stakeholders in these processes also appeared to be very limited public disclosures. Also limited was supply chain transparency. For example, there was little to no disclosure of geographical locations of suppliers, names and addresses, and disclosure of information about high-risk indicators for the supply chain, such as the number of migrant workers, women, number of workers who were unionized or receiving a living wage. So there was room for improvement on companies' disclosure of responsible purchasing practices, as well as processes for tracking the effectiveness of grievance mechanisms and provision of remedy. But with these insights, we began engaging with the companies we assessed, starting with, of course, a letter of introduction outlining our research, which was by then published in an anonymized fashion, and the particular issuer's score. So each company was at a different stage of awareness and familiarity with the UNGPs and human rights due diligence and the oncoming laws. So we tailored each engagement accordingly. And over the course of engagements with these companies in 2023, we saw some significant developments. I can provide a couple of examples. So one major grocer undertook a third-party led human rights risk assessment and disclosed in 2023 the most salient human rights risks within its supply chain to support its understanding of where to prioritize focus. Another grocer was already in the process of strategizing with regards to enhanced human rights due diligence. And at the end of 2023, published a very clear and strong human rights policy commitment with details about operationalizing its strategy enterprise-wide, which we viewed as a significant milestone. If we could go to the next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, the mining sector had the highest scores, perhaps reflective of the greater level of scrutiny on this sector, due to it being very high risk for adverse social and environmental impacts, and therefore the provision of enhanced or more detailed disclosures by mining issuers. But like all other sectors, performance on policy commitments was the strongest area of performance. Mining issuers assessed performed least well on tracking and reporting on the effectiveness of actions taken to prevent and mitigate human rights risks, which is in alignment with what Talia had been talking about. Some companies provided limited disclosure on implementation. No companies disclosed how affected rights holders are involved in the evaluation of whether actions taken have been effective. As part of our engagement work with mining issuers, we actively sought out the views and perspectives of rights holders through engagement with them directly or their representative groups, such as NGOs, to ensure we have a holistic and balanced perspective of company performance on human rights and are not just relying on company disclosures. In one case, we were alerted by a representative of a locally affected community, a rights holder representative, who brought to our attention outstanding concerns regarding environmental impacts from the mining operation, and actually recently filed legal complaints that were in the public domain, but that had kind of flown under the radar. And subsequently, we requested a meeting with the mining issuer to discuss the concerns because we had not been fully aware in previous discussions. So through kind of closing the loop and hearing kind of directly from this rights holder representative, we brought that perspective into this discussion, and we used leverage in this case, asking the company what it was doing to conduct adequate consultation with rights holders and establish satisfactory remediation to the concerns. And obviously, given how quickly social license can deteriorate in especially resource development and mining in particular, we viewed these efforts not only as essential human rights due diligence, but also as critical due diligence to mitigate potentially financially material risks. So we were pleased to learn not long after our engagement with the company that a settlement had been negotiated out of court. And we are currently in the process of confirming with rights holders that this settlement is viewed as satisfactory remediation for them. So we're trying to, again, circle back and just get the whole wholesome, holistic perspective. In our engagements with another mining issuer, we sought out the views of an NGO group very active with locally affected rights holders at one mining asset to help inform our engagement strategy with the company that has multiple ongoing controversies. And we found this approach to be very helpful. And we have touch points with this NGO at a regular cadence to help us ensure comprehensive and effective due diligence. Because as Ian had pointed out, the root cause analysis of controversies or impacts is critical. And so that kind of engagement with rights holders for investors is instrumental in helping to do that root cause analysis. So we continue to engage with this particular company, and we're making our expectations for best practices known and recognizing the efforts they are making to enhance their processes. But going forward, we will use our leverage in support of remediation where appropriate. And if we could go to the next slide, please. In 2024, we will seek to further understand, track, and report progress through this engagement campaign, as well as through new research we'll be undertaking. And this will help us fulfill our obligations under steps 4 and 5 of the OECD due diligence process. In the next 6 months, we plan to conduct a smaller research project based on the disclosures Canadian issuers were required to make by end of May 2024 under Canada's newly enacted Forced Labour and Child Labour Prevention Act. We will try to assess company progress based on these new, more rigorous reporting standards and where there are gaps, and we will try to derive some helpful insights and make recommendations for next steps and priority areas of focus for our engagement efforts going forward. And thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. And by the way, the tone's really great. So if you want to come back on camera, and if Ian, you want to get on camera, I think we're good now. First of all, Sarah, that was really fascinating. Also, just to see, from an investor perspective, how you're going about through your research and engagement with these companies in terms of fulfilling your own human rights due diligence responsibilities. Just one quick question, because there is a question that Ian was asked in the chat that I want to get to as well. With regards to your experiences engaging with stakeholders and also participating actively in some instances with regards to ensuring that there's remediation as appropriate, did you find at all that the stakeholders had any challenges in understanding what your role as an investor was in all of this? I'm just curious. Did you have to kind of explain first, like how do you fit into this in relation to their issue that they had with your portfolio company?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think managing expectations when consulting with rights holders and stakeholders is really important. So we need to be sensitive to many things. One is that it's important for us to hear their views and perspectives, and we will to outline what is it within our capability with regards to next steps, and to be transparent about that. But as I noted at the beginning, we're majority passively invested. So divestment is also a challenge for us at times because of the way our assets are allocated through these passive investing instruments. We can, of course, make investment decision making and divest in the actively managed funds, but there are some limitations there. But secondly, we also need to be really careful about safety issues with regards to consultation with rights holders and ensuring we're not doing any harm in that regard. So it's working through NGOs and rights holder representatives is helpful to kind of and of course reading any reports that they publish like desk research. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at with that.
Thank you. Thank you. So one question, hopefully, Ian, we can maybe do a quick 30 seconds because we're going to have to wrap up here. We have seen how social audits have been severely deficient in identifying human rights impacts. Can you explain best practices for auditing firms to ensure that they're actually finding those human rights harms? For example, should audits be unannounced? Does the payment structure lead to a conflict of interest between the company and the auditing firm? In sum, is there a continued role for social audits? If so, how can they be improved? I know that's a huge question. If maybe you could kind of...
It's a great question, and I'll go for one level above the auditing firm, and that is without an accreditation body, without an organization that oversees the auditing firms, you can have a huge number of auditing firms and they're all competing for the same dollar. And yes, the system can just crumble. And so an accreditation body is hopefully an organization that actually audits the auditors. And the good thing is they can also produce the methodology that should be used, the durations of audits that should be used, can provide that and put it online so everyone can see the methodology used. Also, stakeholders can get involved and make sure the methodology is rigorous. The competencies of the auditor are rigorous and not just left to the auditing firm to make up. So having an accreditation system to make sure that the auditing firms themselves are actually operating well. Then yeah, in the tactical area, as you say, a mixture of announced and unannounced are good, but you can get the unannounced to make sure that organizations aren't just presenting themselves. In England, we've got the saying, I'm gonna use the old fashioned one about the Queen. The Queen thinks the world smells of wet paint, because when you turn up, it's all been freshly decorated. So yeah, having some unannounced visits are definitely good, but an accreditation body that can oversee and manage the durations and methods of the auditing bodies and sack the ones that don't come up to standard, and remove the accreditation, is an essential piece. Without that, the auditing firms are just freelancers making a fast buck.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you. That's that's very insightful, considering you're coming to us from this world. It sounds like multiple levels of accountability and oversight are needed. Well, we are over time. I want to thank our speakers. This was tremendously informative. We got to hear some really good practice examples, dive a bit deeper. Thank you so much. This recording will be made available. And yes, I wish all of you a good rest of your day. Thank you and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.